Hi, everyone, and welcome. So, today we will be discussing the final book in the Ash and Sand trilogy, Kings of Heaven, and of course, we will be discussing the series as a whole now that we finally concluded it. So, I am joined by a group of amazing booktubers, and if you haven't heard of them, I'm very surprised, but I will link their channel in the description box down below. However, what I'm most excited for during this discussion is that we are joined by Richard Nell, so the author of the trilogy. And Richard, thanks again for joining us and taking time out of your days to talk to a group of nerds, basically. It's highly.
Well, I belong amongst you, and it's my pleasure. So thanks very much for the invite.
Hi, Ashley. So before we continue, I do want to give out a warning that this is going to be spoiler filled. So we are going to spoil the entire trilogy. If you haven't read the books yet and you are a fan of grimdark fantasy, I do suggest you go and pick them up. And I have, again, linked some spoiler-free content in the description box as well. So if you want to have a spoiler-free review, that's there. But for now, we are going to jump into spoilers. So if you haven't read it yet, please leave this video.
At long last, I can spoil it all.
It's been a long ride. So to start, what did you think of the ending, Stacey? How did you like the book?
I thought it was a great wrap-up to the trilogy. But I did not enjoy this one as much as I did the second. When I say that, though, it's like a 4.5 star instead of a 5. Only because I want to make sure that the second book gets its proper rating. Mm-hmm. I'll talk about it in more detail, the things that I wished that I didn't get from it that I had hoped for. But otherwise, I loved it. There were a couple of things that I wanted a little bit more information about, but it was, everything was kind of tied up in the end, and I did enjoy it. As the trilogy overall, I mean, I can't, even with the last book only being 4.5 stars, I'd still give the trilogy 5 stars. It was a great experience. It was a good story. The writing was done really well. The twists and turns, I just can't get over how well that was executed. It made sense. You never felt like, oh, that was convenient. No, everything was done really well. Excellent. I'm not just saying that because Richard is on video.
Hey, it must be tricky to try and review a book. The guy's staring at you. I could walk off.
I'm looking away from you as I speak.
Yeah. So, I completely loved the book as well. I must say, for the first two, I had expectations because I knew that Brandy and Steve loved it. But I was still like, oh yeah, it's going to be fine, but nothing spectacular. And then I read those two, loved them. So my expectations were pretty high for the final one. And yeah, I loved it. It was amazing. And what I liked especially is that in the first two books, there were so many twists that I thought that the last book was going to be very bleak. And I had all of these expectations that everything was going to go wrong. But then in the first few chapters, Ruka could actually catch a break and some things started to go well. So I had hope, and that increased my investment in the book. I think that you have some series where everything goes right and you just know that the hero is going to survive, and that's a little bit boring to read and you're not that invested because there's nothing at stake. But then you have the other end of the spectrum where everything goes wrong. And then you lose your investment as well because you know that nothing's going to be good in the end. And here you had that balance. And that made it very difficult to predict. And I really loved it. And Randy and Steve.
Sorry to interrupt you. That balance that you just described, I think you've just really touched on something there. And it's interesting, when I first put these books out, I'd never even heard of grimdark. People told me that was a genre, and they described it to me, and they said that that's what this book was, and I said, sure. Whatever helps sell books, I'm happy to say that's what I did. But I'm with you. I don't like bleak. I don't like, so even though the first book probably comes across as more bleak, in the end, it's sort of always darkest before the dawn. You have to sort of get to the hope with a long slogging journey. And as you say, to keep the interest, it has to be clear that things can fail. I don't like those books either that, there's a place for it if you're watching like one of those serialized TV shows where the main character is going to survive. And I understand the place of that, and I even like some of that, but that's sort of not what this series is. It's the stakes are high, and I'm trying to keep that tension up, and just as you've described. So I like to hear that.
So, Brandy and Steve, upon your reread, did you have the same feelings, or did some things change?
No, it's the same for me. It was fun to go back and look over, all the stuff that I loved so much, and I'm with you, Yolene, about I loved that you never knew what was going to happen, and that things were at stake, and it was hopeful in the end, So.
At least a little bit.
Yeah. There's still some some surprises in that last book. But my favorite part of the reread was hearing all of you talk about it and being there to experience it. And because I was dying for all of you to read it and to hear what you thought about it. So I'm glad that you all enjoyed it. And it was fun to reread it again and to go. My thoughts are still the same. I appreciate it even more. I caught some things I didn't catch the first time. So it's no secret that it's my favorite trilogy. I'm not just saying that because person up here in the top right. But
it doesn't hurt.
That doesn't hurt, But I am waiting for hardcovers, Richard. I want a hardcover version, so get on that.
That'd be nice.
We'll get there. Though I think Amazon is now doing its own hardcover program, so it might make my life a lot easier if it's doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, what Ashley is saying, yeah, for sure. I know that I had a bunch of predictions that just everything was going to go wrong. When I started the third book, I was relieved that it wasn't that. That, like I said before, that you had that balance. And I know that, well, if we're talking spoilers anyway, we had that moment with Aiden and Berman, where and I thought that Aiden was going to die. And then that didn't happen. So okay, yes, it's fine. And then Aiden had to go over to the horse people, and I thought that he was going to die there, but it didn't happen. And then I was relaxed, and then he died. So I loved that I was just wrong every time when I was predicting what was going to happen in that sections.
So I had to go back and reread that like immediately. When Eagle says that he's dead, I'm like, wait, was he, or did they just capture him? So I had to go back and read. Like, did I miss something? And then I read it. I was like, oh man.
That's funny. I have to tell you, that death hurt me pretty deep. And so when I figured the reader might be a little bit the same, and I didn't linger on the death. So it's funny that you hardly even caught it. That's how I felt. I just wanted to just move on.
Yeah.
But it was very surprising. Like Yolene said, is you relax because you're like, okay, the danger is over. And that was sneaky, man. Did not expect it at all.
Definitely.
It was so sneaky that, like I said, I missed it. I was like, no, that didn't really happen. And then it's like, what did it?
And those sneaky deaths, like sort of Red Wedding style, Oof,
Yeah.
They get you.
Yeah.
And that makes it more, I think that makes it even more impactful when it's not a big drawn out thing. It's just, it happens and it's over and it's, oh, let's get out of here and we have to leave. I think that makes it more effective that we don't linger on and talk, it just happens and it's done and it's the shock that it happened.
Yeah.
It keeps
And
moving.
it was just the right amount, because then when that happened, I thought that Eagle was going to die as well. That something was going to happen with him or his wife or something like that. And when that didn't happen, it was like, yeah, okay, that balance is restored again. It's fine.
Yeah, but I didn't breathe until they were back in Orhos, and I was like, okay, they're greeting the ships, so they're good.
That was a lot of characters risked at once. Yes.
But you never really feel safe though in this series. No one ever really feels. You never really feel 100% safe ever. Really.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. Because at the end, you're getting up and looking like, okay, I only got like 50 pages left, so I think everything's good. And he's waving at the ships that are coming in. With all of his Ruka is waving at the ships of all the people, and then that storm starts coming. You're like, what is Kale up to? And then I was like, that's not Kale. Oh man, that was so good. It's like, what?
Yeah.
And I had forgotten, I don't know about you guys, but I had forgotten, like the danger at this point was the Emperor, and I'd totally forgotten about that. I don't remember what was his name again?
Ando.
Yes, and I dismissed it, forgot about it. It was interesting. It was something I wanted to know more about, but I was like, okay, this is the story here. And so when that happened, I was like, oh yeah, that was cool.
See, it nagged at me, the whole time. I was, there's something. And I got it at the end.
Yeah, I felt like I forgot it as well because it was something in the beginning. I think that it was mentioned again briefly with the monks, but then everything else was so impactful that it took a back seat. And then to put up at the end, I thought that was a very nice conclusion that Ando, a minor character that you met in the beginning of the series, actually had a very big impact, and that he was part of the reason why the Vision left at start. Yeah. I wasn't expecting to be that big of an impact.
Yeah, well, I don't want to completely take over your question, so I can save mine till later maybe, but I'm curious about people's thoughts about Ando. Let's put it that way.
I'm curious about Stephen Brandy. So reading that, if they went back and read those sections again in Kings of Paradise, were there any clues? Was there anything that made you go, now that you know who he is, or essentially, was there anything in there that you're like, oh, how did I miss that?
Not a ton, I don't think. No, not too much.
I mean, it was just like, yeah.
I don't think I would have caught it the first time, but
because my impressions of him originally was he was a teacher, and I thought that there was something special about him, obviously because he was teaching Kale how to I call it astro project, because he was basically able to leave his body. So there was something to Ando, and I knew that he had the same abilities, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to teach it. But I didn't think, at no point did I even think Kale was a descendant of God, or God. He had godlike powers, but it never occurred to me that he was a god. And so it never occurred to me that Ando could be that. And then I just thought, he's just a monk, and maybe his powers did not extend as far as Kale's. So I dismissed him. And he never even came into my mind. I think he even was in King of Ash when Ruka meets him, right? And even then I was like, no, it's just Ando. I never thought there was going to be more than that.
Well, for me, I hate to even compare, but I had recently read The Blade itself and that whole trilogy, and I had Baez vibes a little. Do you guys with Ando? Just a little hint. And even in the end, it was just kind of like the whole, we do this, over periods and generations. We have to, wipe you all out and start over again. And that's kind of what he did in that story. So it was, but this one was better. I don't know. This version of, I don't want to say like he's a version of Baez, but it was that kind of storyline that, I don't know. I just really liked it a lot better than what Joe Abercrombie was trying to do with kind of the same trope.
Eat your heart out, Abercrombie.
Brandy says.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear thoughts about that, just because it's there's varied opinions, and I guess one of the themes in the book is that the characters have no idea what's going on. There's a lot of ignorance in this world, and there's a lot of beliefs about things which are not true, superstitions and so on. And so, I guess I pull that all the way up, till this confrontation with Ruka and Ando, let's say, where even this godlike character has his own beliefs about things which are not true. And this is a fairly pivotal scene where Ruka almost breaks down laughing, sort of a life as a tragedy or a comedy, where he realizes that this godlike being thinks the sun is a divine, he's got a religious belief about the sun, where Ruka in his lifetime has discovered through a variety of scientific methods, let's say, understanding more about this sun than this 2000 or however old this being is. And he's saying, how much time have you wasted? How many people have you destroyed? If you have this false belief, what other false beliefs do you have? And of course, that's all left, not explained. But that's sort of the point, I suppose, of this character, and maybe one of the reasons why, sort of to you, Stacey, where it doesn't seem like he's important. Well, he sort of isn't, right? In the lives of all of the characters and the plot of the book, he really isn't important. Yet at the same time, he could wipe out everything, more or less. All of these people's worries, their trials and tribulations, to Ando is nothing. He could destroy it all, and he has in the past, is sort of the implication. All for a belief or beliefs which make no difference, or maybe are wrong. So that's sort of the point. He's a tidal wave. He's an uncaring God. It doesn't really matter what he is. It's that he does have that power, and he could destroy everyone's hopes and dreams in the blink of an eye, and he doesn't care what they want. And how do you deal with a force in the world or in the universe like that? So I guess that there's some questions I'm leaving there. And let's pretend you have a character like Ruka. You could even make Ruka worse than he is, but if Ruka can stop Ando, does that justify Ruka right there? So there's a question, I suppose, I'm asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
justifies Ruka in what?
What's that, sorry?
Justifies Ruka in what? In his actions?
Yeah, let's say Ruka is even a nastier character than he is. Let's pretend he's more villainous. If you have a villain who's sort of a low-level villain, let's say, who can stop an awful villain, does that justify the behavior of the low-level villain, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
I think that's exactly what happens here, though, because I'll be honest with you, I was not Team Ruka in book 1.
Right, yes.
It wasn't until he starts defeating or working against a worse villain that I went, oh, I like him.
Right.
And ultimately, by the end of the 3rd book, I'm like, I'm not even Team Kale anymore.
Well, you might say the same thing is true of the Emperor, right? Ruka against the Emperor. Is the Emperor worse than Ruka? Probably he is, though there's systemic problems there, and you can't just blame him. But so I guess it's an escalation. You've got this sort of nasty character who defeats a nastier one, and then defeats a nastier one. I don't know the answer to that. I'm playing in that space. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, with Ruka, I didn't really have villain vibes, but maybe I just like those characters and I sympathize with them. I had the same feeling with Valen in Bloodsong, where he's just trying to do the right thing in a world that is completely broken. So you can't play by the rules, because then you won't win. You just have to do it like this. And I actually felt for him a little bit, where he tried and people just wanted to see the worst in him the entire time. And I was actually happy that in the beginning you have Kale, and I thought that in that grove he was not going to listen to Ruka at all, that he was just going to destroy everything. And I actually liked that even though he hated him throughout the entire 3rd book, Kale did see that he did something wrong. And I do think that Kale and Ando are like this thing. I always visioned Ando as Kale, but then maybe a couple of centuries earlier, and he has been a godlike creature for longer. Nobody challenges him, so he still is that boy. And he doesn't really get any new information. And if nobody challenges you for centuries and everybody treats you like a god, you are going to believe that what you think is absolute truth. And I think that Ruka says something towards the end where he says, you are a god with infinite power but little knowledge. And I like the other way around. And I like that line a lot, because I think that that's exactly what's happening there.
Well, that's music to my ears. It's always interesting, you're saying, Steve, your favorite part is listening to the other people talk about as they read the book. It's so weird as a writer, because you never experience people actually reading the book. I just want to sit there and stare at people. Like, where did they laugh? Where did they grimace? Where did they, you don't get the reactions from people. And it's very strange profession in that way.
Yeah. Definitely. But I think with Ruka, I think he's sympathetic because he's trying to do the right things, even if he does terrible things along the way. I think do the means justify? Does his goal in the end is to help his people and bring them to a better place and have a better life for them. And one thing that I loved about the trilogy and that I love just in history is when cultures collide and these totally different cultures start to meet each other, and they all see each other as barbarians. Everyone, whether whoever you want to call a barbarian, they all think of each other as savages. So I really like the way that was done with the way that there are different viewpoints, different points of view, that they all saw each other as savages because they're all different.
Mm-hmm.
So I really like that. Was there anything in history that you studied or you kind of read up on to have that set up?
There's so many examples that it's endless. That is the story of humanity. Where one group of people finds another group of humans, and all of the beauty and tragedy ensues. Because that's where new ideas often come from. That's where many of the great things that make us go from people in caves to where we are today come from, is the sharing of different cultures, basically. But it's also where all just terrible events come from. And I'm trying to think of there's a good book. I'm trying to remember the author now. I think it's Jared Diamond. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. It was fairly famous for a while there.
Yeah.
Well, he writes sort of in terms of a modern history, what shaped the modern world. And he's saying, well, the invention of guns and steel, and that's in sort of one category. And the swapping of disease is another category. Saying, there's a lot of talk about when one group of people finds another group of people, we think of war, but often the disease kills far more people than the wars. Far more, to the point where it'll often destroy civilization because it's destabilized so much by the death, which is just horrible to think about, but it is reality. So partly that's, and you haven't read Dark Sea's End, or we'll talk about that maybe later, but it's another version of, look, here's another culture finding another new group of people. So even in this world of Ash and Sand, where I'm showing this new culture has found this mainland, the world is even bigger than you think. And here's another group of people who find, so I guess I'm sort of obsessed with that. And my favorite book is Shogun by James Clavell, which is all about that. It's this English pilot and Dutch crew who finds a new world and trying to understand them, and all of the individual and cultural stories that follow.
What was the title again?
Shogun.
James Clavell.
Oh, I have read that.
Okay, yeah.
That's with the one guy who gets stranded on is it Nagasaki? I can't remember exactly where he's at.
Which I can't remember where he washes up exactly, but
I loved that book. That is one of the best books I've read about Japan culture during that time period, because you're seeing it through the eyes of a person that we have more in common with than we do with the people that he's. And just one of the things that I remember most from it is their diet and how he struggles with their not eating any meat. So all they eat is fish and vegetables, and they don't cook the same way that he does. It was just that was the coolest part.
Yeah, there's so much of that. It's a great book, and I recommend everybody read it. But it's one of the hardest things in life, and this is true of all of us, is to realize we are deeply set in our own culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's especially true of the West these days, where a lot of people think we don't even have a culture. Everybody else has a culture, and we don't. It's sort of the attitude. Mm-hmm. And we say that in English, just shake my head. So we are so deeply set in our own cultures. It's one of the hardest things in the world is to understand the world from somebody else's cultural perspective. And that is what Shogun is truly trying to do. Mm-hmm. And actually, the author himself, so he was a soldier in World War II, and he was captured by the Japanese. And so he was a prisoner of war for, I don't know how long, but quite a long time. And basically, he was so horrified by them, and he couldn't understand it because he saw them as very honorable. So at first he saw them from this very honorable behavior, and then he saw them treat him and some of the other prisoners in this just absolutely brutal ways. And he was trying to square it. He was trying to understand, how could these people who are these honorable soldiers and so brave and courageous and culturally sophisticated and impressive, how could they treat people like that? And so he was really trying to understand it. And I think by the end of traveling in Japan, because he went there after, and by interacting with a number of the other Japanese soldiers and so on, he finally began to understand the world from their perspective. And partly that's why he wrote these books. And so it's just a very interesting story of the author himself.
That is great. And I do see some of those inspirations in the Ash and Sand trilogy, because you don't just talk about the overarching cultures, the differences just between their beliefs, like the way they treat women and things like that. It's also their clothing. So the difference between what you have to wear when you're in the freezing cold weather, and the other thing is the women obviously have to wear a little bit less modest clothing in the islands because it's hot, but yet women seen immodestly is a bad thing. It's just kind of that there were a lot of times where you saw that like inconsistency, like when Lana goes back home and she's wearing her silks and they're like, oh, what are you wearing? It's like, you go down to the islands and you tell me you don't want to wear this stuff. Well,
it's hot in Nong Ming Tong too, but it's one of those things where people get ideas and then the reality doesn't matter. So, if a modesty trumps comfort, then that's, you're not allowed to wear the silks. You're not allowed to, you have to wear whatever it is you need to wear and cover that up. And there's people, culture is never, even though it's based on reality, usually, if it's a successful culture, there's all kinds of weird inconsistencies that people have about, how people should behave. And, anyway, it's endlessly fascinating to me.
And there was no end to that. It amazes me, the imagination that an author has to have to think of all of those things, to remember to put them in there so that the characters can react to those things. And a lot of times we, as readers, we take a lot of that for granted because, when you read a good book, now it's your expectation that world is going to be fully fleshed. But it's when in fantasy, you're not just taking the world that we already recognize. And it's a lot easier to not, remind the character or remind the reader of all these things because they should know that a door opens a certain way. So but when you're writing fantasy, you have an entire world that you have to build. So it irritates me when people downgrade or denigrate fantasy as being a lesser genre. It's like,
what are their names? The trick there is, unless you're Tolkien, and then you have trees.
Yeah.
But the trick there is to do the iceberg, where you just show them the bit of the iceberg that sticks out of the water, and they think that there's an iceberg underneath the water, but they can't see it. That's what you want to feel in a fantasy world, that it seems like it's a complete world and that it's real, even though you've only shown them 10% of it, because A, showing them the whole iceberg is boring, and B, you don't really want to come up with the whole iceberg, so it works out. But you can definitely get, because writers are obsessive people. That's how we do this, if you want to know the truth word. So I always have to be careful not to do what I call the Moby Dick effect, which as interesting as whaling is, you probably don't want me to go on for 5 chapters about whaling, which is what happens in Moby Dick, by the way. For huge stretches of time, he describes like the different physical characteristics of a sperm whale, and the different harpoons, and so you don't really want to do that to a modern reader. They will put your book down in fairly short order.
Yeah. And
there are ways to get around that. And I think you do that very successfully, Richard, is you show them the world through the eyes of the character. I mean, I think I know a lot about the Ascom just from Ruka's experience there, and the same with Payu from Kale and Ruka's experience. But at no point did I ever feel like I was being told these things. I just know about it because I know their experience, all the characters have experienced it.
Well, that's great. And I mean, that's just one of those things that you have to try and do well. And I personally am a shame-based motivator, so anything I do, like I look back and I think, shit, I should have done XYZ. If I read my own work, it's torture. And so editing for me is always like that. Yeah, that's true.
That's
Yeah,
really
you
nice.
can. Amy here. Yeah, you can show more as time goes on, and I think a lot of you liked book 2 a lot. That was really your favorite book, or one of your preferential books, and that's because book 2 is able to do that. It goes into the bread and butter of Ruka experiencing this culture.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of shogun-esque, where it's this guy washed up in the new world, and you get to experience it through his eyes, more or less. Whereas in the first book, we're experiencing the culture through characters who live there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's much harder to, if you live there, you're not going to notice all the day-to-day life things that are happening because you're used to them and there's nothing, so it's much easier when you bring in a new character and he smells them and he experiences the weather for the first time and he looks at the people for the first time. And so that's what you get to do as a reader. And I think that's a really enjoyable experience, but it's hard to do that in a book 1 where they're kind of isolated to their cultures, if that makes sense. If I was smarter, I would have had Lanny maybe as more of a point of view because she's in this foreign culture and you could do, but then she'd lived there her whole life and that's hard too. So I don't know. It's hard to do it.
Yeah,
And
No,
sorry,
you
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Yuli. No, go ahead.
So I actually I don't know which book I like most because after I finished the second one, I thought like, okay, this is definitely my favorite of the 2. But thinking more about it, the coming of age story in the first one, that was pretty strong as well. But I think it doesn't really suffer from middle book syndrome that a lot of trilogies do because the first one almost felt like a prologue, and then you have a duology of sorts because you go back in time and then the next 2 are told chronologically again. I think that's a great way to overcome that middle book syndrome, where most of the time you have that first book, that's really great, and then you have the ending in the third one, and people want to make a trilogy, so they fit in that second one, and that feels like nothing is happening. And that just didn't happen here at all. And I think that's maybe why a lot of people were positively surprised by that second one. Because I normally, for a second book, I don't really expect much. And it was the complete opposite here.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And it's weird because the way I thought of the book, it was kind of like a duology, as you say. The first book and the second book are truly intertwined in a way. I think most books, most series just don't do that. And there's a reason they don't do that. Because people read the first book and they think that's sort of different. That's not, there's a lot of things hanging. There's a lot, and it's not until you get to the second book in the series where you think, oh, I get it. And it all kind of meshes together and you think, oh, that really worked. But often people, if they read the first book, if they like it or they don't, and they put it down and they don't get to the second book. So there's a reason why you don't see that very often. And it's probably not that smart. But I don't know. I did what I did, and it's sort of sad to me that you don't get more artists taking these kinds of chances these days. There's all kinds of different ways you can write stories, and this is just one of them. But market forces are the reason why it isn't done.
Yeah, I think that's a big reason. I think if you would have been, if these books would have been published by a major publisher, they would have told you can't leave all this stuff into the second book. You have to add this in the first book. So
absolutely,
this would have never happened. We would have never had this experience if it wouldn't have been self-published.
And I'm open to the criticism that maybe it was a bad idea. Like if some editor said, let's figure out a different way to do this, We're going to tell the story chronologically. I don't know how it would have been done. Maybe some brilliant editor could have figured it out for me. But in the way that I was trying to do it, the main purpose was kind of to subvert expectations. In other words, there's more to the story than we realized. There's more to the character than we realized. There's more to the history of these two lands than we realized. And to sort of flip that and to say, okay, now I don't know what the hell's going on, and now I have to read on. So that was kind of the point. But again, it took 250,000 words to get there. So that's, I don't know. Is that smart? It is what it is.
No, I loved it. I'm of course I would have rather you had, I would have rather it been published and had more people read it than, because self-publishing is tough to get traction with. But,
just give it time.
Oh yeah.
I can't wait.
Yeah. But I do think part of what makes art interesting and fun is when it's not perfect, when it's not polished. And when it's a little, when there's a little bit of imperfection, that's what makes it special. That's what makes it great, is when those chances are taken, and it may not be smooth and perfect, but it is what it is, and that's what makes it great.
Well, and what's perfect, usually when you want perfection, it's much easier. For example, I often think of a figure skating routine. They, I don't know why, but my mother was a big figure skating fan. Maybe if you want to do an easy routine, if you don't take any chances, perfection is pretty easy, but it's also boring. It could be the perfect routine that nobody is interested in. They might say, "Good job, you did that perfectly," but they never want to see it again, or they'll forget you immediately. Whereas if somebody's doing quadruple spins or whatever, even if you fall, they'll watch your next performance. They want to see if you can land the quadruple spin. They want to see if you can do that difficult thing. And I find so much in every art form these days. Pop music might be a good example. It's 2-3 minutes. It's a fairly shallowly done, but very polished performance. Where you could hardly criticize it. Right? There's nothing to criticize, but it's also out of your mind instantly. And much fiction is like that now, especially if it's short. Whereas in the indie world, you're getting these beautiful messes, that are just trying all kinds of crazy things. And I'm in the same boat as all of you guys, where I don't want to read the really messy ones. I want to read the ones that are sort of talented messes, but it's hard to figure out the difference, right? And so that's why we need bloggers and reviewers and YouTubers like you guys to point out which ones are the beautiful messes. So other than that, there doesn't seem to be a great way to do it. But that's why I do this. Is to do that.
Okay, can I tell you guys something funny? When I was reading Kings of Heaven, and you get to the part where Ruka is building the staircase to get up to Ando, and he's got 2 broken feet, and he's got to climb the staircase. I was thinking, dude, why don't you just build one of those chair things that kind of goes up the stairs? And then I was thinking, wouldn't that be funny if he was like slowly sitting in this chair that's slowly going up, and Ando's just sitting there waiting. And I was laughing, and my husband's like, I thought this was a serious book.
Would have been easier.
Yeah.
Just halfway up. You know what? Fuck this.
Yeah.
Ski lift.
Yeah. Why not build an elevator? Come on, Ruka.
Well, he was coming up with some good technology. He could have.
Yeah, Richard, I was wondering about Ruka. Was there ever a concern writing the series to not make him too powerful? Would you have a line for him to not cross?
Yeah, I mean, it was tricky because I knew he'd have a fight with Kale, and I mean, especially by the end of the first book, let's say, if you were to say who's going to win in a confrontation between Ruka and Kale, I'd say it's Kale. So he's up against that, and then I knew at the end he'd be up against Ando. So he's the underdog in both of these situations, really. On the other hand, yes, in his own land, let's say, before he is interacting with Kale or Ando, yeah, there's sort of this, what do they call them, Gary Stew. where he's the smartest and he's the strongest and he's the best at everything. So there was some concern there. But usually when I write, I like to create a character who is sort of either very ambitious or very intelligent or very competent. And despite their best efforts, it's not enough. And so that's sort of what Ruka goes through. He goes to save his mother at the Circle of Law, and he fails. He kills Kunla and tries to, hoping to destroy it and change the world, and it doesn't do anything. It's irrelevant, basically. So a priestess is dead. They appoint a new one, and he sails off to more or less kill himself because he thinks there's nothing I can do here. He gets to the new world, and he learns about everything, and he sort of gets thrown into a king's prison, and he fights his way free of that, and he gets to a new king, and he's still nothing. I mean, he's so he can't change this world. He can't. So on and on it goes, basically, until the very end of the story, where he kills Ando, which is truly a change in this world, because what we didn't know, but for thousands of years, they've all been more or less under the thumb of this powerful individual who has been breeding people for his own amusement, or maybe for a reason. We don't really know. He has destroyed cultures. He has wiped out kings, and Ruka stopped him. And maybe Farahi stopped him. I will throw that out there. So even then, I should point out that despite Ruka's powers and all his beautiful, it could be that he's being manipulated into this action by Farahi. And anyways, I'll just throw that out there, based on the let's say the letters that are being given at the ends, right? Which maybe I should ask you guys, what do you think about Farahi's letters after the fact?
Oh, I thought that was a really good twist. But I have to admit that at the time I was kind of thinking, I feel really stupid admitting these things, but this is where my brain goes. At the time I was reminded of, do you guys remember, I can't remember David Letterman did the same skit, but where he would put stuff in the letter and then he would put the envelope to his head and he would try to guess what was in the letter. Do you guys remember that skit?
Yeah, vaguely.
I couldn't help but think Farahi would have been hilarious if he did something like that.
Chehen, he had his little board game,
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, where everybody else is playing a board game and he already knows the ending.
But I thought the letters were really cool. It was a way for us to kind of see that he had a lot more planned. I think at some point I thought, I don't think he expected to die. But although there was where he knew that there was some danger with Kale, right? It's kind of why he kept Kale at arm's length. But he didn't really know exactly where Kale fit in. And that was always kind of a mystery. You're like, what is going on? And so when Kale, accidentally on purpose kills his dad, I was like, did Fry see that coming? And so with the letters, you're like, yeah, in a way he did, because he knew he wasn't going to be there, which is why he wrote them in the first place. And I liked that, especially the one that is given to the Tong king. I can't remember. Is it Kapuli?
Yeah, Kapuli.
I'm really bad with names, so I apologize.
Me too, and I don't care. I make the name really as sort of simple as I can, one or two syllables. And yeah, I'm the same way when I read fantasy. If somebody's got like an accent in their name, I'm out.
And thank you for that, by the way.
Yeah.
To make the
Yes.
name short and easy.
And I like that it was part of the culture, in the Ascom to only have 2 syllables in your name. And if you have more than that, you were just weird.
Yeah, well, I think there's some, what's the right word for it? Social posturing going on there with a lot of cultures and people's names. They make their names long to sound important.
So I'm curious, Stacy and Yulene, what you thought of the ending with Lani and Ruka, because there's some hints there. So see what you think about it.
I just choose to believe that it is, because I thought that it was very well handled from the start. It was like a slow burn romance at the background, and I thought that it was believable towards the end. So you know that somebody must have fathered those children, and you know that it's not going to be her husband. So who else? And I hope that he had his few moments of happiness, because during the entire trilogy, he believes that nobody but his mother can love him because he's a monster and he's horrible. And even when Lani tells him positive stuff about himself, he thinks that she's doing it just to save herself. And I would have liked him to finally believe that. I'm going to choose to believe that it is. And in the end, that would also achieve his big goal of the two people living together. Even if nobody knows that those are actually his children, they would eventually be part of the royal family. So yeah, I thought that would be a fitting story. But I also liked that it was kept, like, you don't really know for sure. And in that sense, I also like that history teller that you have at the end. He just has that one chapter, but there you can definitely see that the people who survive choose what kind of history is written. And that's something that you see in some other fantasy stories as well. And I just like when you have that touch.
Yeah, I really liked the chapter as well.
So Stacy's whose kid is it?
To be honest with you, I wanted Dala and Ruka to get together. So that's what I was looking for. And only because I thought she was a perfect match for him. He needs a strong woman. If that makes any sense at all. Not that Lani wasn't strong. She was definitely strong, but in a different way. Whereas Dala understood him. And I thought it would have been pretty cool for the two of them to get together, considering her where she's at is ultimately because of him. And I don't even know, did he ever at any point realize that she was that same girl? I know that she knew who he was, but I can't remember if there was any point in the book where he realizes that she was the girl that he left to die, essentially, in that little cabin.
You know, that's a good point. I don't know if I ever explicitly pointed that out.
I don't think he ever knows that. So it just would have been a kind of a ironic pairing because
there's one, I think there's only one mention of it that I remember in the first book when he's seeking revenge on Kunla, and Dala is helping him sort of escape his apathetic fate. And he looks at her, and he's sort of his memory is sort of matching it vaguely against a girl from a farmhouse, like, so he's, sort of seeing her from that farmhouse, but I never make it explicit if he knows for sure that it's her, and or if it's just a momentary lapse in his memory, or if it carries on.
Yeah,
anyway, I like leaving a lot of these things open, and it's a bit tricky, just especially when I've got people sitting here looking at me saying, what happened with XYZ, and I think whatever unless it's explicitly spelled out, whatever you want. I mean, and I know there are some readers who don't like that, who are sort of more the Brandon Sanderson style. It's like, how does the magic work? What is the history? How did he get his power? I'm sort of more on the magic realism side, where, in a world where magic exists, and just in a world where, as Yolene said, history is being logged by human beings who don't know and who have their own spin, and the world is being observed by people. Let's go back to Kale. Let's say when he comes to return home and he thinks this is what's happening and he's wrong. What is actually happening is hard to determine. And one of the reasons that Ruka has a sort of special place in my heart, let's say, is that he alone amongst pretty much every character in this world, despite being very hard on himself, and I would say he's hard on everyone, not just himself, he does ruthlessly attempt to look at reality as it is. And that includes himself, even when he's, there's a moment there where remember when he's animating the dead corpses as he's riding, and to the Emperor as for his last charge. He's in his own mind, he's creating a sort of myth for himself. He's tempted to do that, where he's remembering words that he said to Aiden years ago, that no fire can burn a land of ash. And he's thinking, did I predict this? And the answer is almost certainly no. It's just he just had a throwaway line, and it made sort of sense at the time, and now it made sense again. And he's sort of again ruthlessly saying to himself, "No, you're not a prophet. Stop it." Whereas a character like Kale or Ando, especially Kale, let's say, who's a good, I think we'd all say is a good character, is a good person. We'd like to think of him that way. Is susceptible to falling prey to his own rationalities and his own, he for example, he thinks he can teach people this magic that he was taught by Ando. There was never any evidence that was true. As an example, I'm not saying he couldn't, but there was no evidence to suggest it was true. So anyway, I'm off on a tangent now.
No, but you make a really good point, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not going to say I dislike Kale because that's not true, but why I didn't prefer him over Ruka more is because he let his power kind of go to his head, right? And he's sitting there pouting in the grove, if you will.
Well, he was dead.
Well, I know, but even after he realizes that he could come out into the world and he could actually do things, he doesn't do it again until the end of the book. So this is one of the things I was like, I was a little upset with you, Richard, because I was like, I wanted to see more, like, Kale didn't even come out except to shine the light on the Emperor during that whole Emperor battle. It's like, come on, dude, you just gonna sit there and pout because we know you can do it. So I was a little irritated with him.
Frustrating.
I don't think we've seen the last of Kale though. So
yeah, old Mahir's pointing out that he seems to recognize him. Yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. And again, I mean, I think maybe as a writer you have to. I love all of the characters. I even love the bad characters because I just sort of understand them. To create them, you have to understand them. And I even understand like a Kike, and there's a world in which I have the same feeling of ruthlessness in me where I think, well, if I had to protect my family, what would I do? How far would I go? And sort of to go back to Kale, I understand. First of all, it's hard to know what to do with that kind of power. It's sort of the wise man story of always saying, well, we'll see, we'll see, we'll see. It's like, well, he should just kill the Emperor. Should he? Should he, what happens then? Should he kill Ruka? What happens then? Should he? So it's difficult when you have that kind of power to decide what to do with it. And again, that is maybe to go to when you were saying you wish Dalla and Ruka had got together. Ruka has a real judgment of Dalla, which he sort of tries to sort of put to her over the years, let's say. But at the end there, when she's saying, no, join our people, come back to our people. And he's saying, I can never be on your side, basically, because you feel no guilt, because you've killed people and you've done these things and you think it's justified and you have no moral compunction about it. And he's saying, I don't. I've done these terrible things and I think maybe they were the right thing to do, but that doesn't make me good. He has that moral understanding or at least of that judgment, good or ill. And I know there's readers who've said, God, I wish he could just get over that. But to be what he was, he recognizes that took horrifying deeds that he'll never quite be sure if they were justified. And there's another moment with Eagle where Eagle tells him, if I could do it over again, I would. And Ruka says, I wouldn't.
Even though he knows that he saved his people and all the people of Bayou.
Right, and I think that's a very logical argument. I mean, I think you could justify. You could say Ruka's behavior is sort of, if it's a moral utilitarian argument, let's say, that the good outweighs the evil. Let's say, but he sort of is saying, I don't want any part of it. It was too terrible. I would rather just go live in the woods, and be sort of a creature of the forest or something, and not have to have made the decisions I've made. And so that in my mind, that sort of makes him very, I don't know what the right word is, and I guess you guys could have your own opinion and tell me what you think. But for me, that's sort of how I feel. Sometimes when when life is difficult and you're thinking, do I choose black or white? You'd rather just not make the choice at all, though of course that is a choice too. So I very much understand Ruka's perspective, and it's a horrifying situation to be in. But I think what makes him ultimately a good character maybe is that in the end, what does he do? He tries to help people at the end. He thinks, okay, what are my gifts? I have this great mind. I'm going to use it, and give all of the produce of that to everyone I can. So that sort of, if he had lived in the civilized world and been given the opportunities, if he'd never been born in the Ascom, that's probably what he was, right? He would have become an academic of some kind, and he wouldn't have hurt anybody, and that would have been his life, probably, right? Whereas, so I'm always asking that question: what is a character's base nature? And that probably is, if he had succeeded, his base nature, unless he had succumbed to the Bukai egg. We've all got
man, I loved that. I loved how those two kind of came. You kind of got them together right through most of the story, and you're always wondering if they're really the same, two sides to the same coin. And at the end, they actually split, right? You get that where, I just thought that was the coolest thing. And what I liked about I wish I had tabbed my book. So I read it in the Kindle because it was easier than carrying around the hard or the paperback. So I had the perfect opportunity to highlight things there. But there was a line in there where it's described where Bukayag outside of Ruka is described, and he's like almost like a shadow with claws, and I was just like, that's the perfect description for what you at first are thinking of him, is a physical description as to how he acts. I don't even know. I can't even explain what I'm trying to say, but
I understand sort of the dark manifestation,
yes.
of the personality. Which, well, much of the quotes drawn from Bukayag, and I did this with lots of the world, but are sort of taken from real people. Some of them serial killers, some of them, conquerors. And there's a quote there where he's standing on the ramparts of the siege, and Ruka is sort of breaking down from all of the death and all of the violence, just thinking, that he realizes that this is going to get worse, that the Noranians are not going to stop, essentially. And Bukaya, of course, is loving life at this moment. And, everything he's ever said is being confirmed. This is what humanity is. And he says a quote that was from a serial killer who was executed. And these were his last words. And he said, "If I wish humanity had one neck so I could choke it." And so that's what Bukai, he says something like that. He says, "I wish humanity had one heart so I could tear it out and chew." And it's sort of that nihilism and that desire to just destroy the world. And you can understand it, right? It sort of goes back to when Ruka was a boy and he's looking at his homeland thinking, this will never improve. The world is a terrible place, and you born and you suffer and you die. So what's the point? So that's how you get that Bukayeg character. It's giving into the shadow. It's school shooters. It's these 17-year-olds that walk into a elementary school and shoot 25 people and then themselves. That's Bukayeg sort of in a nutshell. And so it can manifest in anyone as far as I'm concerned, though I would suggest the more impressive, the more power an individual has, the higher, the greater the chance of that shadow being a terrible thing. And again, if you look at Ando, right, where he's fighting Ando at the end, and Ando's shadow emerges, and it's this monstrous creature that sort of can tear apart the world. It's the same, an aspect of the same thing.
which I guess is why it was so interesting, because I'd always expected that from Bukayag. And so when, Ando, even though he's the same kind of, it's the same kind of thing, like you just said, he has his own idea of what humanity should be, and anyone that doesn't fit that should be destroyed. But yet, because I don't even know, I just didn't expect it. So when I saw it, it was a little bit more jarring than when Bukaya came out. I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I pictured. So it was kind of interesting because they were more similar than you thought until that point. You're like, wow.
And this might go back to, I think maybe Yolene and Brandy and Steve are more Ruka fans than you were, Stacy.
Yeah.
And I that's a completely fair point. And what I would say is, no matter what you intend, right? People think like, oh, I just want to make the world a better place. Almost all of the most terrible human beings in human history have legitimately believed they were doing the right thing. Yeah. Even if you look at a guy like Stalin, though you could certainly debate this one way or the other, but you can make the case that he was legitimately trying to faithfully implement what he saw as the future of humanity. And yet, how many people did he kill? Mm-hmm. So you can say about Ruka, no matter what you're trying to do, let's just look at your actions and your behaviors and the consequences. So that is a perfectly fair argument that I'm, and so when you say, why is it sort of similar to Ando? Well, Ando's the same way. He thought he was his goal was to bring humanity back to divinity, sort of in his mind, that he was to restore something that humanity had lost and to make them great again, so that's his goal, ostensibly. But look what what were his actions? Pretty much all dreadful, to having infants killed on a fairly regular basis because they didn't match his criteria. It's hard to get worse than that.
Yeah. It's so weird how by the end of the third book, I had forgiven Ruka for all of the things, including the very first page of book 1. And part of that is because his actions have spoken. The other is by the end of the third book, you realize how hard all of those things were on him. He wasn't just doing it because he believed it was right. He did it because he believed it was right, but it didn't make the action right. If that makes sense. Like like you were saying, he felt like, yes, the outcome was positive, but the ends don't really truly justify the means.
Yes.
And so he didn't. Well, he felt.
Again, he alone amongst all of these characters says, not only am I going to hell, I deserve it, and I'm willing to bear it.
Mm-hmm. Right? I think that's what made me love him.
Yes. I think that is what makes him sort of empathizable. We can say, look, here's a guy who's willing to do what he has to do. So that's step one. He's willing to do nasty things, terrible things, whatever is required of him. He knows that they're not right, and he's willing to pay the cost. Mm-hmm. Whereas most characters, and Dalla included, and yes, Mahir, I know we'll talk about Dalla in a second. Yeah. She's not willing to admit that what she did has anything other than benevolent, mm-hmm. Right? So she's not looking at her behavior sort of objectively or from the perspective of the people who have been harmed, or, And again, I'm not saying Dalla is a bad character or anything like that. I'm just saying that's the difference between them. And he can't, in his mind, he can't cross that divide.
Yeah, I also think that the big difference between Dalla and Ruka is that Dalla gives a lot of orders, but she's not the person who's actually doing it in the majority of the time. And that's also why Berman has bigger conscience and he has to deal with that more than Dalla. I think that she can write it off as, okay, yeah, it was a bad thing, but for her, it's just words on a piece of paper. While Berman and also Ruka does a lot of these things himself. And I think that hits harder.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
That's a good point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's always something to get your hands dirty.
Mm-hmm. That's something that Ruka does throughout the series. Is he gets his hands dirty. He's always, when they're building the weir or the dam, he's there helping build. He's there working around the clock so he's always in the thick of it. And I think that's how he gains a lot of respect from his people, as he's in there doing it with them, not just ordering people to do things. But back to the comment about Dala, and I think Dala does recognize Ruka's eyes, and then also I think Ruka recognized her by her face. I don't know if they ever had the conversation, but I think it was maybe an unspoken thing, but they both knew who each other were. And that scene in the cabin on Kings of Paradise is so great.
Yeah.
That's when I knew this is going to be a ride.
I do remember though her recognizing his eyes.
His yellow eyes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I know for sure she knew who he was.
Well, it's sort of one of those things that she, it could be explicit or not. She recognized his eyes, no question. So then in her mind, I think there was a time when she thought those eyes were sort of a representation of another servant of her God. Was it the same man? It didn't matter. And she sort of, the same thing with the owl gave her this sort of belief somehow that there can be predators that serve God too. So that's how she saw Ruka. And that's maybe how she even saw him, whether or not he was the same guy in the cabin, that it was another stepping stone, another rationalization, right? Anything that happens to her, she sort of rationalized it. It's another step on my journey towards serving God. And Kale was a little bit like that. Most human beings, I should say, we rationalize anything good or bad that happens to us. We say, well, it made me stronger, or it needed to happen so that I could go on to the next step in my journey, or I was rewarded for good behavior, sort of karmic belief. I'm not saying it's true or not. You can believe what you want, but that is human behavior.
And Yulian and Stacy, what were your thoughts on Dala? Is she a true political hero?
I think she's definitely
first, Yolene. I'm not sure.
I must say that of all the people that we had in the stories, probably Dala was the one that I liked least of all. I think that she's definitely good at politics, but she has very selfish reasons for it. And I think for everybody else, even Ruka, he does it for his people, and Dala does it because she has a view of how the world should be, but her view doesn't necessarily make living better for her people. It's just how she thinks that her God needs to be served. And I think that she's a lot more ruthless than everybody else. And you could say that to be a good politician, you need to be that. But for instance, you have Berman and Dala's relationship, and that is something that I did like in the book, that they just drifted apart. In a lot of stories, people get together and they stay together forever, or they become enemies afterwards. And this is just how real life is. They got together and then they just drifted apart. And Dala she can very easily just let go of Berman. She goes back one time just to say like, hey, you're going to die tomorrow. Please don't. But she doesn't really try too hard. And after that, it's like, okay, this is going to happen. And if you compare that to Ruka, for instance, when he sees Berman again, even though knowing that he fought Aiden, he tries to help him again. And he's more human in that sense, I suppose, than Dala. And that's maybe why I disliked her most of all.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. Those were my feelings exactly, especially the way that the relationship with Berman kind of at the time that he wanted to fight Aiden, that whole scene, it just made me go, you know what? You never cared about him. He was just a tool. And that made me dislike her even more. But I don't think Ruka would have made the progress he made without her. So she was maybe not as important to the outcome as he was. But it was definitely, and that's the reason why I said they're kind of made for each other. They could do a lot together, because one, he's the one that gets his hands dirty and makes things happen, but she's the one that works through the politics, if you will, of the ASCOM. But is that necessary anymore? The ones who are still in the ASCOM are the ones that want to be there, and the ones that want a new life having a way to get there. Is there still a purpose for Ruka? And I think the answer would be no. He's done his thing. Let him live his life the way he wants to. I was upset about. I had really thought that Dala was going to have some kind of magical powers when they were on the ship, and the storm was coming, and she was like praying. I'm like, oh, we got to find out Dala's got some kind of. So shame on you, Richard, because I wanted, even though I didn't like her, I still wanted somebody else to have some kind of magic.
I mean, who's to say she doesn't? The ship made it.
True. That's true.
How do we know how it made it? Maybe it was Dala's magic powers that kept the ship together.
I'm surprised to hear your answers because Dala was my second favorite character, I think, after
You
Ruka.
just liked the ruthless characters, Steve. That's just
Yeah.
who you are.
I think I said this to Steve in a conversation a long time ago, but based on who you like, I know a lot about you.
I think
should
it's
be
also
worried.
a girl thing. I think women tend to be more critical of other women, even fictional ones. And so I think that might be.
It's interesting that you say that. I've had a few people who absolutely hate Lanny because of her moving on from Kale, basically, and for sort of being interested in Ruka, who's Kale's killer. And it's been women particularly who are just like that, two-faced, connive, just harsh. Which I thought that's a little unforgiving. That's given the circumstances, and people like to judge other people a lot, I guess. But I thought that was nasty, a little too much. But hey.
Yeah, it's especially because Kale moved on, right? Even he moved on pretty quickly. So I don't blame Lani after he died.
Yeah. I mean, he died. I can understand people going, yeah, but that was his killer. But you have to ask yourself, did she believe Ruka? Right? Because he told her about Farahi that it was, if you understand everything and believe what Ruka told, if she believes everything Ruka told, then why wouldn't she be able to forgive him for Kale?
Yeah. And getting those kind of reactions, Richard, is that satisfying for you? And even if it's a negative reaction to a character, like, oh, I hate this, I hate Lani, is that kind of fun for you to hear, even if it's?
I love hearing every perspective like that, for sure. I don't care if it's harsh, especially if it's not harsh, like this book sucks. If it's, I hated this character. Even you had a reaction where you were saying one of the side characters, oh Lord, Asna. You had quite a negative reaction to Asna. You're like, this guy, you sort of hate him almost, right?
Yeah.
That was surprising to me. Hatred of Asna was shocking to me. Sort of a general dislike, a general like, oh yeah, this guy's going to be a problem. But I was surprised by it. Hatred of Asna. And again, I love hearing that. It's so interesting to hear people's feelings, because for me, I guess he was sort of a lovable character, even because I sort of knew where he ended up, and also he was fun to write. So he's had a place in my heart just because he was fun to write. Anyway, it's just funny. It's funny hearing those reactions.
Yeah, I just didn't trust him. I just didn't.
Because he's a mercenary, right? It's hard to
trust him.
Mercenary.
But he's a character we never really explored that much. But he's another example of his people come from this nomadic situation, and the reason they're nomads is because their homeland was destroyed, and they've more or less been treated like crap and hunted down like dogs ever since. And so again, you have to understand, this guy comes from a situation where you call him a mercenary, but imagine living in a world where pretty much everyone hates you since birth. It's sort of, think of like almost like a Rona or a gypsy, that's sort of his situation. Where his people and their heritage are either destroyed or seen as bad, and he's from partially a bit of a warrior culture now, where they have become mercenaries to keep themselves alive. So why should he have any loyalty to anyone? Ask that question, right?
At what point did you hate that character? Was this the second book? Because surely it wasn't in the third book.
It was in the first book.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's a completely legitimate hatred. I was surprised. I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have realized that.
Yeah.
That comment that Yolene just had that is a really good point. I like the way that you said that takes simplistic, non-fantastical approach to change.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, well, so again, if we look at Dalla and Ruka, how did Ruka think he could change the world? Well, he was in theory capable of becoming the son of heaven, and what did he do? He said, no, it's not politics. Basically, he thought, I can't. That's just who has power. That's not how you change the world. How you change the world is you solve problems. You invent new things. You come up with new ideas. That's sort of how he saw the world changing. Whereas, let's pretend Dalla had been given the opportunity to become the matriarch of heaven.
Yeah,
she would have taken that in a heartbeat, right?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but she probably would have acted reasonably benevolently, that. So I'm with Mihir in a way, in that she would have tried to help people. But just as Stalin found out, and just as many great dictators of the world have learned, just because you are trying to make things better and got some ideas about how to do that, doesn't mean you're right. And so if you try and enforce your will on the world, it might end disastrously. And unless you're willing to do what Ruka has done, which is sort of to look really critically at himself and his actions and say, okay, I screwed that up. Or, you just kind of keep going, right? You think, I'll just crush these people harder, or I'll implement my beliefs more forcefully, so he doesn't trust Dalla not to do something like that, just as he doesn't trust the Emperor not to do something like that, and so on.
So we've talked a lot about Ruka.
Yes.
Let's talk about Kale, especially in so I will say that this trilogy is a lot more about Ruka than it is about Kale. Kale obviously plays a big part in the story, but his character his character arc is not as vast of a change. Like Ruka's character changes significantly throughout the trilogy, and I think that's the reason why I love him so much. Mm-hmm. Whereas Kale, the only thing that changes is he gets this power, and his view of the world is a little bit different. But he's always kind of been that wanting to help the underdog kind of thing, right? I mean, even when he was training for the Marines, he was trying to help those guys who he knew were not passed to find a way to pass. And so that he kind of approaches, when he gets these powers, approaches that I'm now going to be the captain of people. I now have this power. I'm going to use it to help those who can't help themselves. It's a very different view in the world than Ruka does, but wants the same outcome, if that makes sense. But I guess what I wanted more from Kale is, even after his death in the second book, I thought that Ruka would have more of an impact. He does have quite a bit of an impact on Kale and Kale's view of things, but I wanted more. I wish there had been more interaction in the Grove with Kale. And I liked that Kale took it upon himself to go and read and learn all the stuff where he had access to the library. I liked that, but I wanted more of that. How about you guys?
I compared it a little bit to Beyond Redemption, because there you also have main characters who die, and won't say anything more, but they do still have an impact, some of them. But I actually like this here, because his death had an impact, and he could change very little after that. And you could still see where he could do certain stuff, but it was still very clear that he was dead. And I think that was something, after the second book, when he was in Kale's Grove, in Ruka's Grove, I thought like, oh yeah, and next time he's going to come back to the real world, and he was dead, but not really. So I liked how that was so unexpected, because normally a main character who dies, one of the main POVs, that doesn't happen that much. So even though I wanted to see more of him, I was glad that that expectation was not met, that I was actually surprised by what happened.
I was okay with it too. I wouldn't change anything about the way that I'm with Yolene on that totally.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I certainly understand Stacey's perspective. And in a way, as I was trying to decide how he would continue, how would he grow, how would this go on, and when you say he was changed by Ruka and by reading these books in the library and by, sort of being overwhelmed by new evidence in a way, even though he said, well, look, it could all be lies. It could be, it's your world. He's sort of so struck by he realizes, I think, that maybe Ruka is hardly capable of creating an elaborate lie like that. He's sort of a blunt force object creature, he just bashes you over the head with reality until you weep. And so he sort of can't, by the time he's finished reading it, he can't disagree with it exactly, but he's also still dead. He recognizes that it's too late, and I think he's part of it probably comes across as a great deal of anger and hatred towards Ruka throughout the third book. But I think a lot of that is also towards himself. He's angry at himself for the part that he played in his own life and his own death. And so he's coming to grips with that. And I think we would all struggle to do that, and all you have to speak with is the killer. So that's a difficult situation to be in. And he's trying, I think he's ultimately, his journey in the third book is finding peace. And so he's sort of on his own in this land of the dead. And in the end of the book, what does he do? He saves Ruka.
I know. I loved that. Talk about subvert expectations. One of the things that you did is when Ruka gives him the opportunity to talk to Lanny, I thought, oh, here we go. This is going to be one of those, what was that movie? Ghost with Patrick Swayze. I was like, oh, here's going to be, but no, it says not through your lips. And I loved that because he's like, no, I'm gone. I don't want my last words to her to be from you.
And what could he say, right? Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. I've had other people have different reactions to that, but yeah, I think ultimately he's trying to find peace. He's recognizing his situation, and there's a part when Ando says to him, "Look, let me just take care of these people on their stupid little ships, and then I'll come back and I'll extract you from this guy."
Yep.
Right. So he points out that maybe he's got the power to bring Kale back to life and put him in a new body or who knows what. And more or less, that just rolls right off Kale. He doesn't give that time of day, essentially. So Kale's arc for me, I agree with you. He doesn't change as much as Ruka does. But ultimately, because he dies and then he goes through a redemptive. His final act is peace with his situation and redemption by saving Ruka and fighting Ando, which he succeeds at. And even Ruka is taken by that final act. He's sort of amazed that that's what happened. And you haven't got there yet, but in this book, Dark Sea's End, there's some small continuation of that amazement.
Yeah, we are reading that next month, or discussing in December.
I liked the line. I had to go back and get it because I wanted to make sure I got it right. The last thing that Kale says to Ruka is, "I forgive you, Ruka." And then he says, "But I'll be honest, I hope this hurts." I was like, man, that's the perfect line.
Well, you'll forgive him his little petty revenge. We're all human after all.
Yeah. Are your dogs upset, Yulene?
Yes, I just texted my husband, like, come and get him, because he's outside with friends, and they are constantly like watching through the window, wanting to be there. So now they're gone. At peace and quiet.
How
Now
many
there was
dogs?
one.
Sorry, I'm kind of getting off topic now. You've got Jolene has 2 dogs. Stacy's got dogs.
I don't
no?
have dogs.
Oh, okay.
No.
So there's just 2 out of them. I'm not a dog person, but I'm always amazed by the love and attention. It's hard enough for me to just keep children alive.
Yeah,
Dogs are easier, I would say.
yes.
But less
I've had pets my whole life until my son was 1 and my last dog passed. She was 13, and we got a lizard, a bearded dragon, when he was 3, and that bearded dragon has found a new home, and we're like, no, it's hard enough keeping my son fed and clothed, and yeah.
Sorry, I derailed Jolene.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about one character, but I was thinking the entire time about his name, and I don't know. It's Osco? Something like that.
The Kale's friend, the Mezzanite.
Yeah. I actually like that we saw a lot more about him in this book, and it's one of those storylines that I quite enjoy, where you have somebody who has a very clear goal, but he needs to work with the enemy to get there. So I quite enjoyed his storyline, and also that you have him and then the other friend of Kale, who is completely the opposite, where Osco is very devoted, up to a point that it's almost ridiculous. But I liked that at the end, he still also met his goals somehow, and that it maybe wasn't the happy ending in the end, but it was fitting for his storyline. And I would have been heartbroken if he, in the end, didn't get his happy life after having to deal with the emperor for so long and basically being a slave, when that was everything that he wanted to avoid. So I like to see more of him in that third book.
Were you surprised at the beginning of the 3rd book when he goes back to his family and he ends up getting enslaved? I wasn't expecting that. I mean, from the end of Kings of Paradise that his family is a little bit treacherous, but gosh, I was not expecting them to hand him over like that. And I guess in a way he did too, because he even said, his first instinct was to wait so that he could make sure that it was safe, but he had missed his wife so much and he was tired, and he obviously wasn't thinking clearly after trekking across the desert by himself. But yeah, I mean, this trilogy has you really can't go into it with expectations, because Richard, you will find a way to I mean, even if I were going, he's going to get there and they're going to capture him, I certainly wouldn't have expected it when he snuck into his wife's bed and it turns out to be somebody else in the bed. I just was like, wow, how did they even know he was coming?
It was a rough reception for a man who just crossed the desert. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that that wasn't seen. That's sort of what I mean about watching a reader, like did this work? Did this work? Did this work? You don't know. And it's tricky. So I'm glad to hear it. You didn't predict that. Though I get the impression Brandy predicts most of the things that happen.
Yeah, she's good.
No.
Yeah. Well, she did. We were reading Kings of Paradise. Well, I read it first, and then she read it before we read Kings of Ash together. And then she came in the room and she kept going and said, "What's going on with these dates? Because there's something to these dates." I'm like, I don't know, like whatever. And she's like, "There's something going on here with these dates. Have you looked at them?" I'm like, "Not. I mean, I glanced at them. I didn't pay that much attention."
He was like, they're probably just...
I was like, "No, it's just usual fantasy stuff." She's like, No, there's something to these dates." And then we started reading Kings of Ash. And she's like, "I told you there's something to those dates."
I knew it. But it was awesome, though. Like, I couldn't predict. I mean, it was just something. I knew there was going to be something, but I didn't know what it was going to be, so it was awesome. And
well, that's good. Well, I never expected anybody to, like look back at the dates and think, what year did what? It was just really an indication that maybe something's happening here. So you had the right reaction.
Yeah, for me, it wasn't. I was obsessed with them, not like totally obsessed, but just that there's something to them. Like, why are they here?
It's just a bit of a signal. Why are they here exactly?
See, I took that as just another one of those pointing out to the reader the difference in culture, because
That too.
Same.
everybody having the same dates is a very modern
Yes.
concept, right? It wasn't always the case. And so it was kind of neat, especially with two cultures that have no interaction whatsoever. There's no trade going on between them. They don't even know each other exists. So you wouldn't have the same way of keeping track of time, other than except day and night would
I have to
probably be
tell
the only
you,
way.
time is a real pain in the ass in fantasy because people do not have Greenwich Mean Time. Okay, they don't have clocks. They don't have. So you're trying to say like 15 minutes later. It is a real pain in the ass to deal with, like how much time has passed and how are they measuring time, because human beings have done that so differently throughout history. The only thing that saves us is that the average reader doesn't care and doesn't pay any attention to it. So the thing to do is to just not pay that much attention to it. But I'm a history geek, so I'm like, well, no, they would do it by the moon, and they would do it by the.
I like that.
Well, one thing I remember from our Kings of Ash discussion that we had, one of you guys, I can't remember who it was, said something to the effect of, "Can Ruka bring back the dead? Can they come out of his grove?"
No, that
One
was
of you guys
yeah.
said that,
Predicted it.
and
Yeah.
I can't remember. Was it you, Yolene?
I don't think it was me.
No,
I think it was
was
Ashley
me.
or Brandy.
It was me,
Um,
but I did not expect it to happen. I didn't expect it to happen the way that it happened. I didn't even expect the way that Kyle was able to come out to be I don't know what I was expecting. Honestly, it was kind of a hope, not really an expectation. And so I didn't really think through how that would happen, but that was cool. It was really neat.
That was awesome.
I was really surprised about that, and I liked the way it was done. That comment, Yolene, that was up there about Asuka, what was that last thread? I don't remember what that was.
So when they're discussing Osco essentially being made the son of heaven, Ruka is saying, don't abuse these people, or else, I'm going to come to your deified, sanctified crypt, because these people he knew, all of the dead warriors of Mizan were kept in a tomb and buried with their arms and weapons. And he's saying, screw with me, basically, and I'm going to animate your ancestors to wipe out your people.
That's right. I remember.
Which is sort of the most horrifying thing that someone like Osco could possibly imagine happening. So that's what he says. And I made a little allusion to it later on in the epilogue, where the historian is saying that one of the last acts of this steward, or whatever you want to call Osco, first chancellor, was to disarm, to remove all of the weapons from his ancestor's tomb.
I remember that.
And he was throwing this, bizarre, but
I like that kind of writing when you've got a point of view that is not privy to the information that you have as a reader, and their take on actions, things that have already happened, especially if it's in the form of somebody that's writing a history, or I like that. Robin Hobb does that a little bit in I can't remember which one of the Fitz books in the beginning of Farseer. There's a character that is trying to, I think, retelling some history that you witnessed, and it's different, and you're like, or they interpret it in a different way. So it's kind of neat to see things like that, especially in this case so quickly, because it's like almost like a joke, an inside joke for the reader. So quickly, Yolene, you've read a lot of fantasy recently that has a lot of battle, war, and it hasn't really been your favorite. So I'm curious what you thought of that part of Kings of Heaven, or even the end of Kings of Ash.
Well, I've come to the realization that I actually do like it, but it needs to be written in a specific way, where it's from the point of view of one of the characters, and there needs to be some kind of tension where I'm actually afraid for what's going to happen. And that's what in these big military fantasies I often don't feel, because the people that you are following are kind of like at the back and they are giving directions to all of these people that you don't even know their names. So I don't really feel that when you have two armies just battling together and you have the general overview. I don't like that. But in this one, and I would say that that's the same in Tower Lord by Anthony Ryan, for example, you really are following the people that you feel invested in already. And there is a lot at stake, and you know that the author is not afraid to damage or possibly kill one of these characters. And then I am invested, and then you are reading each and every line. But in these big military fantasies where it's basically, okay, they are fighting, I know that everybody who's important is going to live, I usually skim through it, and I know that I'm not going to miss anything important.
I'm the same way, so I get it. Even though there are people, and I understand, like there's sort of history buffs or military buffs who like reading about the tactics. How are they going to win the battle? So that there's people who like that, and that its own thing. But I think that should be fairly specific to those genres, or I don't know. I tend not to like those either. I'm thinking, what's the stakes?
Yeah, the battles in this series, and like Yulaine mentioned, the Raven Shadow trilogy it's much more visceral. It's you feel like you're there and not an observer. It makes a big difference.
I've only read Anthony Ryan's first book. I can't remember what it's called now.
Blood Song?
Yeah, Blood Song.
It's a good trilogy.
I need to finish.
Still need to read the last one. It's
So
for
many
December.
How many books do you guys read in a month?
Too many.
4 or 5 usually, give or take.
I could do about 10,
Yeah.
but only because I'm on the road a lot, and some of it's audiobook that I'm driving my kids around or waiting for kids to get out of things, and then another reason is that some of it's small, tiny romance novel books. So
Speaking of audiobooks, I guess I should mention the number 2 and number 3 are done.
Whoa.
Won't matter to you people too much, as you've already read all the books, but to the audiobook listener, number 2 will be out in a month, and number 3 will be out a month after that.
I'm totally gonna read these and listen to an audiobook.
yeah, my
So-
daughter will be really excited about the audiobook.
How old is your daughter?
Okay, she's 13. But
Okay, it's pushing it. I mean,
she's read. I know.
so I have a question about that. Maybe that's for all of you. How young would you have someone read this series?
I'm not as opposed to violence in books as I am in, say, movies. So my son, who's 9, reads some middle grade and even young adult books that have, I just don't have as much as, but I think if he was 13, I'd let him read this.
Yeah, she's read Hunger Games. To me, that was crazy to me that middle schoolers read Hunger Games, because I read it as an adult. So I think, I'm okay with it. She's read one of the first Game of Thrones book. I read ahead of her,
Wow.
though.
Okay, I don't know about that.
Well, I read ahead of her because she doesn't like mushy love stuff, as she calls it. So I would read ahead and tell her, okay, skip this part. But she's. I think she's.
Well, even
This could be
Harry
a-
Potter has some violence in it. I mean,
yeah,
you can't.
she just finished all those too.
Yeah, well,
I think this
Stacey
could be
made a
a-
good point. Like the TV that kids are watching, like how many 13-year-olds have seen Squid Game?
I haven't even watched that, but I don't.
I mean,
Am I missing out? I need to know.
it's just
It's all right.
incredibly violent. Like it's
Oh yeah.
so. I mean, I don't know.
This can be a whole nother. We can
Yeah.
talk about this for a long time, but I think, I think back in the '80s when I was little. I mean, I saw stuff like RoboCop, and when I was like 9 or 10, and I turned out all right. I don't know, but I go back and watch RoboCop now. I'm like, holy shit, this movie is violent. I mean, it was more shocking to me as an adult than it was for me as a kid.
Yeah,
How just the violence and the just the blood and the politics and everything and the commentary on that movie. But so I don't know.
Yeah,
think
kids are
it's,
tough.
Yeah.
I mean, he read I should say I read Lord of the Rings to him. And even that has, what I was surprised with Lord of the Rings is a lot of the stuff in the movies, like battle scenes and things like that, they don't actually take place in the books. So when I was reading it to him, I was like, okay, is there going to be, any parts that I need to skip? And it was like, oh, okay, they don't even go into that. But I think it's really, there might be some scenes in Ash and Sand that I definitely wouldn't want my 9-year-old to read. But I think, a teenager, I read much worse. I mean, I was reading Stephen King at 13, and so
Yeah.
and I thought I was a rebel.
I mean, you turn on the national news now, and
Jeez.
what's worse?
Yeah.
Well, and it's usually better to experience these things in fiction and
Yeah.
toughen you up a little bit before you see it in the real world. So,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So
Well, it's exciting about the audiobooks. I know a lot of people have been waiting for that, so it'll be good.
yeah, I've been hearing people complain about it for quite some time. So, and the Dark Seas End paperback is also out.
Oh,
I saw it.
I was going to
sitting
ask you
there.
about that.
Oh,
Say that.
I'm going to
All right,
order my
time to buy
copy
it.
right after
Same.
this.
I want a copy too.
And
I'm
that
not
is
waiting.
on December 19th. So
I probably owe some people on this broadcast a signed copy. So why don't you hold off on that?
Okay, fine. Hold
well,
on.
no, I still have to order one, Richard, because I have to have one to read, and then I have to have one to put on the
Oh.
shelf.
I see. Okay.
That
Well,
I have
I won't
to.
stop you.
Yeah.
You can always give
Unless
one
you-
away or something.
Yeah, no, it's for me. That's
He has a glass case just full of signed copies.
I'm always, I'm not a book collector. I love books, and I have a giant library in 2 different houses in my parents' house. And my dad is always like, "Hey, you've got all these books." I'm like, "Yep, you're holding them until you die." But I'm not a collector. I don't need the new version or the pristine hardback. As long as I have the book, my compulsion to have the book is satisfied, and I'm good. But there's people who just love books, and they collect them, and they keep them pristine, and they it's very important to them. I've come to realize that's a fact, and I try to cater to those people more. I'm going to make hardbacks. It'll happen, but it's new to me. I didn't understand this was a thing.
It is weird. Since I started watching BookTube a couple years ago and seeing that, I am one of these people. I like my book to look like it's been read, so I could go back to it and go look. But I don't like breaking spines. So when I read books, I barely have it open, and I'm like, reading. But if the cover gets a little frayed or frazzled, it's like that adds character. But breaking the spine, it's like you've abused your book. So if its book is on my shelf, it's either read or it's waiting to be read. At least that's what I tell those books. One day.
See, I'm with Josh. I would read it if it's signed.
Yeah.
That's
same.
that's you guys are nuts. You guys are crazy.
I read
I'm
my
not like-
Jeff Lane signed book.
Oh, you savage!
I did. I read it. I touched every page as I read it. My DNA is all over that book.
Different
For
people are
shame.
different. It's fine. You can all have your own. Well, and even people really care about a beautiful book, like the cover art and the all kinds of different illustrations on it. So this is not something I care about. Like, look where I work. Okay. When I worked in an office, I didn't have anything on the walls, to the point where people would come in and they would almost feel pity for me or something. Like they'd be thinking, like, God, don't you want a portrait on the wall, or do you have, put some? No, I don't care. I'm living in my own little fantasy world. It doesn't matter what it looks like outside. Does it have the words inside the book? Great. I don't care what it looks like. So I have to do these things where I hire cover artists to make these things beautiful for people, but I just don't care at all. So anyway, you have to adapt.
I
What
love
is the other
covers.
book that you have there?
So this is The God King's Legacy. So look, we're in spoiler territory so much here. We finished the series now. I might as well just say this: The Dark Seas End is the first book in another trilogy that's beyond Ash and Sand. It will follow immediately the events of Kings of Heaven. But this is all wrapped up into a world that is going to have more books. And indeed, that book, God King's Legacy, is in the same world as Ash and Sand.
Okay.
And it takes place hundreds of years later.
So, what is the other one? I'm sorry, I'm really bad with the
It's
title.
okay. Dark Sea's End and
Dark Sea's
God King's
End
Legacy.
is immediately after Kings of Heaven.
Correct.
And then the God King's Legacy is hundreds of years later.
Correct.
Okay. I did not know. I thought it was I didn't even know about God King's Legacy. I thought the other book was
Yeah,
100
so
years later.
the God King's Legacy is flintlock fantasy. They have guns. They have like low technology guns. But so the technology of the world advances. And then it's a new genre and it's a new, it's not drawing on the characters of Ash and Sand, at least not in this book. But there will be another trilogy, set in the same world. And I've got a lot to do. Let's put it that way.
That's awesome.
I'm excited.
Yeah. It's always nice to hear that there's more,
Mhm.
I mean, there are a lot of the authors out there, and I have no problem when they're done with the trilogy. They're like, that world's done. I'm going to move on to a different project. And that's perfectly fine. I don't have an issue with that. But when you love something and somebody says, oh, I'm going to write more, it's like, thank you.
Yeah, well, I like to finish stories, but that doesn't mean that the world is over. So this character story is over, but now what? So it's interesting to me. I guess I'm a lover of history, and so I'm creating my own fantasy history here.
That's
So
awesome.
you can read the history 300 years earlier, and then you'll be able to move on and read 300 years after and what's happened since, and what characters are remembered and how are they remembered and what are the consequences of their actions.
Yeah, I like that concept. Brandon Sanderson does that with his Mistborn world, because he's got the original trilogy, and then he has the new, which are also flintlock, or more like a Western, I guess, more like a Western, not flintlock. And the characters from the original trilogy are myth and legend, and it's just kind of neat to see that. And it's not done as often as I would like to see. It's certainly not done as well. Sometimes it's they take it that the readers are very familiar with the world, and it's like, well, 300 years have gone by. The characters in this world aren't going to remember things exactly the way the reader has. So take advantage of that. Make it fun.
Yeah.
Make the reader feel like they know more than the characters in that book. And so,
I agree.
Brandon Sanderson does it really well, but some others that I've read, it's like the 300 years, those people are not going to, even though the histories are going to be different than what we witnessed.
Isn't it funny how in pretty much every fantasy world, so many of them, technology almost never changes? Always interesting to me. And especially with hard magic systems, and Brandon Sanderson does this, and he's guilty too, but I understand that style, and that's fine. These people will have magic like codified and understood in a way that's scientific. This is how the magic works. This is the metal you take, and this is the result, and this is the and they don't have plumbing. They don't have antibiotics. They don't have any of the things. The world is like this medieval setting, and yet somehow with this magical force, which in theory should be more complicated and harder to discern than steel, you can't figure out that.
That's such a good point.
It always boggles my mind. It destroys my suspension of disbelief whenever I read a hard magic system. I really have to force myself to get on board. Like, okay, fine, they've done it. I just have to accept it. But
that's one of the things that I liked about his Stormlight Archive books. I think he kind of fixed that a little bit, and he shows how they invent things using their magic. And I like they still don't have plumbing.
Well, and it's tricky. It's tricky, and you have to decide like, what am I going to do with the magic system, and how am I going to fit it into the rest of the world building? It's not like it's ridiculous that they could have this magic system figured out, but it just depends how they do it. anyway, I noticed that that's a trend, but people like it. So that's why it's done. And I'm just the old guy yelling from, for the kids to get off my lawn or whatever. Like, I don't agree with this, but everybody else likes it. So what am I going to do?
I think that was what was so interesting about the magic system that you have here, that you only know as much as the person who's using it. And it's new to them. So it's not like magic is established in the world. And so people, already know who can use it, how it's used, but that it's new to them and you're learning it with them, what their limits are, or in some cases where the limits are only the limits that they put on themselves, in like Ruka's case.
Yes, well, and let me just help you, the Stacys of the world, that if they want to know these things, in the next books, as technology advances and time advances, we will learn more.
I'm excited.
So in the Beyond Ash and Sand trilogy, we're going to learn more, and then in the God King Chronicles and those, we'll learn much more. But there are answers to these questions. You don't know them in the Ash and Sand series.
It's kind of interesting. One of the things that I've noticed in the Ash and Sand trilogy is science does actually play a big role in your books. And history, of course, definitely. But we talked about in the Kings of Ash discussion about how twins are so common in the ASCOM. And Yolene had brought up how, genetics would say, you're twice as likely to pass on the twin gene, because you've got at least 2 or 3 in some cases children, than if you have a single birth. And so, it would be more common for you to have multiple children, and how neat that was, and how they saw, instead of, of course they don't understand science and genetics, so they see it as it's a blessing. And if you have twins, it's, you're blessed by God. The other thing I thought was neat is the magic system, the way that it almost is genetic. So that is exactly what Ando is trying to do, is basically weed out those who don't have the propensity for magic, and find the genetic line that carries it. And instead of it or is it? At least that's the way it appears in the first 3 books. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes. But I thought that it made sense.
Okay.
So I'm saying that because sometimes you read things and you have to suspend belief, or you have to assume there's more to the world that you don't know, and you go, okay. But these decisions, these things that happened in the world made sense. And even if the answer that I'm coming up with, the justification for why it makes sense, may not be the reality, it's still, you've built it in such a way that it goes, you're like, okay, it's not just random people just get, struck by lightning and now they're,
right. Yeah. Well, you have to be internally consistent. Yeah. So you have to come up with a system, whatever that system is. So I have done that, and I don't want to spoil it because it does continue on in the future. I'll make 2 comments, though. One about the twins thing. So we know that Ando was sort of genetically breeding people, and he calls Ruka's people a failed experiment. So the reason that they're all twins and triplets is because he was breeding Ruka's people for thousands of years, and he kept the ones who had twins and triplets, trying to increase his chances. So he is literally the reason. There's, it doesn't matter to someone reading the series, but the actual reason behind that is Ando was breeding them like dogs. I mean, and how we breed dogs or horses or anything else is we take the ones with the traits that we like and we continue them on. And he was keeping the ones who had twins and triplets. So that's why they did that. A breeding program over 1,000 or 2,000 years.
God, that's creepy and interesting at the same time.
Yeah, little fun fact for you. And then the magic system, all I will say is it is complicated. And just like the real world, think of it sort of like, how do you get an illness, let's say? Typically, there's a bit nature and a bit nurture. You'll have a genetic disposition, and then something will trigger it. Maybe it's stress in your life, which triggers hair loss, or, it wouldn't have happened without that stress. So that's sort of how the system is built, that it's like that.
Okay.
And all I'll point out is that there's two places in this world where magic comes from, essentially. One of them is surrounded by volcanoes, and the other comes from a place that's the land of ash, magic volcanoes everywhere. 3 places. The third is these fire weavers from Naran. What is their holy place? A volcano. So there is some geographic element, let's say, to it, obviously. Whether there's more to it, there must be, because everybody who lives in the mountains don't get magic powers. Some people do, some people don't. But so there's a few things I included like that. And if you look at the Naranians, they even have, what do their priests do? They believe there's some sort of there's this holy metal that they use, right? To create their magic. And when they're testing people for this in the mountain to see who might have magic powers, but way back in the first book, the test involves the metal, where if they want somebody to pass the test, they kind of slip it in their back pocket, So they have a knowledge there that they don't even necessarily understand, but has been passed down through time. I don't really explain it. I just point out that that's what they do.
I did notice the metal that the fire weavers had. Did it kind of remind you of like a plutonium, or they were talking about like how their hair would fall out and everything. I was like, man, they got atomic bombs in their hands.
It's not really fair, is it?
No. It didn't work though. Ruka still took him down. That whole battle was really awesome. I have to say something about the Emperor, the Son of Heaven. Is obviously his actions said he's a bad guy, but there were some times where you're in his head and his point of view. And one of I think all of us say, when you're reading Grim Dark, you kind of want to have some connection, even to the villain, right? Because everybody's human, and as you were saying earlier, even the bad guys have a justification and a reason. They don't think they're doing, most of the time, unless they're a sociopath or a psychopath, they're not doing things. They're not being bad just to be for bad sake, right? And he was raised, he's in a line of his family has been the son of heaven for at least a couple of generations. I don't remember if it was his grandfather, but this is how he was raised. He was raised to take that position. This is the way he's been told to do it. And when you take a child and you put him in that situation and you teach him that this is the morally right for you, that you are doing the best for your people by doing this, that is your, then it's hard to blame them for acting on what they've been told is their true values. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, obviously I wanted Ruka to win. I was rooting for Ruka, but there's part of you going, the Emperor is just doing what he's been told for generations and what the people around him have instilled in him, right? They believe that, so therefore he believes it. And he's only doing he's doing his job, if you will. So I thought that I liked that instead of him just being this cardboard cutout of the bad guy, there was more to his character. And I wonder also if you were inspired by Persian history, is that why he created the Son of Heaven? Was he supposed to be? Because it kind of reminded me of Circe. And I'm curious if that was your intention.
Well, first, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one man's villain is another man's hero. What were his goals? He had some personal goals, but he didn't particularly live his life in a way. He wasn't going around gathering concubines and wives. He had his own. He had some degeneracy, let's say, in his personal life, obviously, but still, he was reasonably disciplined, let's say. And what were his goals? Well, his goal was to make the Iranian Empire larger, to increase its glory. So as you say, he was sort of doing his job to make his family more prominent, and that was the belief of his people, that family was the most important thing next to the state and to God. So he was doing more or less what everybody expected him to do. He was a tyrant, but he was a sanctioned tyrant. You know, he was just another emperor in a line of emperors. It was his, and actually these people, I'll get to the Persian thing, but his people believed in what's called lawful revolution. In other words, if an emperor was bad, you were allowed to revolt and depose him as long as you won.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't win, it was illegal, and you and your whole family would be butchered and killed. And
Yeah.
but if you won, then you're the next emperor. Good job for you. And that is what Yiren's father did.
Mm-hmm.
So Yiren is the son of a peasant. So his line is not a line of emperors. It was a merchants, essentially. They're merchants and farmers. And so his uncle, this Uncle Amit, this comes up quite often, wasn't just a merchant, but he turned out to be quite a good general, and his brothers conquered and managed to trick the emperor and get him into a battle and kill him. And so they became the new emperors, and so Yiren was born an emperor. So, a couple things. The lawful revolution is actually more or less inspired directly from Chinese history. And the Son of Heaven is a misnomer, or a title used in Chinese emperorship all the way until the end of the last dynasty, more or less. Though you could still argue that the Chinese are still a dynasty. But anyway, we won't go there maybe. So yes, there was a Chinese aspect, but then there was some Persian or Middle Eastern influence as well for the Iranian Empire. So there's sort of a combination between the two.
So cool. It's really neat how much you pulled from, our history, but, made it your own. And that's kind of been a more recent thing in fantasy, is people trying to move away from the European, based benchmark and start looking other places. And so I liked that. I like that
there is so much to draw from.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing. And again, maybe it's the market forces more than anything, that's what people knew. And so it had to be kind of kept in that to get people interested. But now fantasy has expanded so much, and we've got so many veteran readers of the genre who are like, boring, give me something else, right? So now we can draw on anything, and it's amazing. And there's so much mythology, and there's so many cultures, and it's a very exciting time to be a fantasy writer, because the world is our oyster. You can do whatever you want. Just a question of doing it well and bringing people along. The only tricky part is that you're still dealing with modern readers, and it's really hard for people to put themselves in the shoes of people who lived, with very different technology and with very different beliefs. It's hard for us to put ourselves in their mental space. And especially, let's say, in moral terms, we think things like slavery is wrong. It's completely immoral, and there's no saving it. And that's how it's obvious to everyone that that's true, right? Well, that's not true. It's not obviously true to a great deal of human beings throughout human history. That's just one aspect. Or killing your rival's children was an extremely common behavior amongst royalty in human history. To us, that is just an obviously immoral act, and anybody who does that is a terrible human being. But as I say, that's just sort of a logically ruthless act of a prince or a king who's thinking, if I don't kill this guy, he's got a claim to my throne or my title. Mm-hmm. And so that's just given. And nobody thought of that king who did that as an evil man. They just thought, yeah, he's just taking care of a rival. So it's hard to get people to understand that. Or eunuchs is a good example. They almost make Cale a eunuch in book 1 and send him off to the priesthood. Well, to us, this is a horrifying thing. And we think, only an evil father and only an evil king would do that. But again, especially in Asian history, it's extremely common for princes, especially troublesome princes, to be made eunuchs and sent off to become priests. So, it's hard for that to be communicated to a modern person who's thinking, oh my God, Who would do that? That makes you a tyrant. That makes you say, well, what are you going to do? The prince is being a pain, and you got to stop it somehow. You either have him killed, or you send him to the monastery, or what do you do?
So when you're writing that, the reaction of most of your readers is going to be, "Oh my God, Farahi is a monster." Did you do that on purpose? Like, did you want people to think that so that in book 2 you could go, "Oh, look, now you can understand where he's coming from,"
Sure.
or was it just like, "Hey, this is normal history. I'm going to put it in here"? I'm just wondering if you were trying to be sneaky or.
No, I recognize that no one is going to realize that's common, and so unless you really spell something out, this is how I see world building. Unless I spell it out, so unless I pointed out that a whole bunch of eunuchs existed, and it's I would have to tell you that this is common, essentially. See what I'm saying? Unless I point it out, I assume you don't think it's common. So that's more or less how I think of it. But again, we have all kinds of cultural beliefs, right? Just marriage to us is ubiquitous. Marriage between one man and one woman. We understand polygamy is a thing where a man might have multiple wives. We have enough sort of historical knowledge as a culture to know that that's not weird. So I can include that, and that's just obvious. But to go back to why is European, fantasy the norm? It's because it's really hard to get someone to get out of a European history mindset. So to tell someone that eunuchs are extremely common, that they make up the court entirely, that's not uncommon in Asian history. But to get people there, you really have to make it a thing. And most people are going to be like, well, that fantasy writer really made eunuchs a thing. What kind of eunuch fetish do they have? Like, why are they so? And so you're always in the difficult position of saying, no, it's not me. That's just common to the history of whatever mythology or cultural heritage you're drawing from. Imagine like foot binding, right? Crazy behavior as far as a normal human being, a modern human being is concerned. I see the pizza being like, can you wrap this up so I can eat? Foot binding is like one of those crazy things that if I included something like that, people would be thinking that's crazy. That's, you'd have to explain that. You'd have to go through it. You'd have to, that it came from like one Chinese emperor who liked small feet.
I didn't even know that.
It's almost unbelievable. And then that it was made popularized basically by his court. They were all trying to impress him essentially. And then it just sort of moved down the culture and carried on for God knows how long and caused how much untold suffering. And it also became a method to say, I don't even need to walk. That's how rich I am. Right? And this is true of many similar cultural behaviors like that. For example, not wanting to get tanned. It's a way to say, look, I don't have to go work the fields. I'm rich. I'm inside all the time. Anyway, so on and on it goes. To get people to understand that culture is complicated and that we have our own and that it shapes everything that we think, and that to deviate that in a fictional story, it takes a lot of work. So yes, I'm always aware of that when I'm doing it, and I did it very intentionally with Farahi because I knew that would cause people to think, oh my God, this is horrible. But when we see it in context in the future, and as we pull back and we see Farahi's behavior, okay, it's just one more sort of minorly ruthless thing in the Farahi's day-to-day activities. But we also know that it would hurt him because he loves Kale and he loves his sons. It's not as if he doesn't. He's a human being just like anybody else. Anyway.
I loved that too, because it's exactly what you feel after that scene is he doesn't really care for his son or anyone who's close to him. I mean, he treated Tane the same way in that same scene. But then in book 2, you're like, oh, there's a reason for his distance, his emotional distance, one. And two, it doesn't downplay the fact that he does these things because he loves his children and his people so much. I
He's
like
a bit like Dalla, or he sees the greater good, or he sees the ultimate ends that he's trying to achieve. He'll do whatever it takes, more or less. He's got some. He's not PK. He's not willing to. But again, I would say that's almost more just because he thinks it's ineffective. It's not that he wouldn't torture and murder and slaughter his way to victory. It's just that he thinks ultimately that would fail, because he's trying to unite his islands, and you can't really unite a people behind torture and nasty tyranny. It doesn't work.
Well, I want to say, Richard, I'm really, really grateful for you coming here today. I think we could talk for a long time about this trilogy. I know I could. I really enjoyed it, as I said earlier, and thanks to Steve and Brandy for recommending it to us, and for being so quiet about all of the stuff, because it made it even more enjoyable not knowing anything about these books going into them.
It was tough.
Yeah, it was tough, but I enjoyed that experience myself, so I wanted for you guys to have it too.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's especially with an indie writer like me, getting people like yourselves to pay attention to these books, to help push them, and to just discuss them. It's a great pleasure for me, and vital. I mean, literally, indie writers. It's very interesting as I'm talking about these audiobooks. The narrator, Ralph Lister, is very keen to get them, pushed and to be successful. And so he's okay. What do we do? Do we advertise? And you can just tell that guys in the more mainstream area, they have no idea, right? They don't know what it takes to get people to push these books and to buy them, and the advertising involved, and getting the little reviewers here and there, and working your way through, and getting people like yourselves to take it seriously and to discuss it. And so it's absolutely vital to what I do and what indie writers like myself do. And I'm happy to push everything you guys are doing now and in the future, because you're sort of the lifeblood of the indie market. I mean, that's the reality these days. So if I can push writers your way, or if I can, you just let me know. I'm happy to do this whenever you like.
December 19th. Dark season.
Okay, well, there we go.
Okay, you shouldn't have said that, Richard, because you should know better right now.
I'm washing my hair that day.
Yeah.
What's left of it.
Well, I was actually wondering, so you have 2 beginnings of a trilogy out now. So these are going to be trilogies, both of them?
Yeah. Oh, I didn't even mention this. Yes, this next book will be a trilogy, but I'm not even working on the next book at the moment. I'm working on a completely side project that has nothing to do with Ash and Sand whatsoever. It's my little break before I get back to the complexity of this world. And I don't even have a title yet. It's lit RPG meets horror meets adventure meets comedy. I don't even know. It's much funnier than some of the other stuff I've done. And yet the actual subject is an individual who is descending into literally hell to rescue his friends. Someone joked and called it Senlin Descends.
That's good.
Yes. So I don't know what to call it, but there's a talking sword, and there's a little dragon, and there's a I don't know what to say about
Beta
it.
readers.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm gonna need them, because and it's first person. It's from one character's perspective the whole way through, who I sometimes describe as Samwise Gamgee meets oh God, who's that Western gunfighter?
Wyatt Earp.
It's like Wyatt Earp, but it's not. It's the guy who's dying of TB.
Doc Holliday.
Doc Holliday.
I'll
Doc
be your
Holliday,
Huckleberry.
Samwise Gamgee is my version of the protagonist. I don't know what I'm doing.
Samwise is my favorite character from Lord of the Rings, so
he's my favorite too. That's why he's the real hero.
he is. Why don't people see that?
Because they're stupid. I don't know. Obvious. Anyway, that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know what I'm doing, but it's fun doing it, and I hope to get that out early-ish next year.
Oh wow.
That's cool.
But I don't. We'll see. We'll see. But yes, then your actual question, it is a trilogy, this Dark Sea, the Beyond Ash and Sand. That will be what I do next.
Nice.
So it's definitely best to then start with Beyond Ash and Sand, and then afterwards start the trilogy that takes place 100 years after, or can you just intermingle the two?
In the end, it won't matter. If you were, the way I would do it would be to start at Ash and Sand and work chronologically. Oh, yeah, Josh, I don't know. It has lit RPG elements. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm reading a ton of lit RPG right now. And I'm sort of introducing it's going to be lit RPG light. Okay. It's not going to be like +1 strength, but it's going to be some version of that sort of model.
I don't even know what you guys are talking about.
Same.
It's
Sorry,
nerd talk.
Maury.
Samwise Gamgee is what got me. I don't even care.
Yeah. Well, and so he doesn't say much. As I say, he's like a Doc Holliday character. I'll just say he has an illness, and so he thinks he's dying. So he's pretty fearless, and he's sort of a blue collar guy. He's pretty acerbic wit. He doesn't say much, but when he does, tends to be at somebody else's expense. Anyways, interesting character already.
Can't wait.
Can't wait to read it.
5 stars already.
And that's going to be a series or a standalone, or?
It's written basically as a standalone that has room to be expanded. But it'll wrap up more than any book in the Ash and Sand trilogy ever has, all on its own. He goes down into hell, he gets his friends, or he doesn't get his friends. He comes back out of hell. The book is over.
So I just saw that we've been talking for over 2 hours now.
I see that. Yeah.
It's been a while.
Eat your
So
pizza.
we can, again, meet up next month, maybe. We can definitely continue the discussion. I don't know if anybody has any closing remarks that they wanted to mention.
I said mine.
Just want to say thanks to all of you, and of course to Richard for coming by. It's always a pleasure to chat books and culture and history and writing and just goofy stuff. So it's a pleasure. It's always nice. So thanks to you for taking the time to come by and talk with a bunch of nerds about your books.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And also thanks Brandy and Steve for recommending this one. It's neck and neck with my other favorite grimdark series of all time. But yeah, it's amazing, and I can't wait to read the next book next month. It's the Chronicle of the Unhewn Throne trilogy by Brian Staveley.
I haven't read that. I should do that.
It's completely different, but I feel like he's also he had a degree in history, and he used a lot of what he knew to make his world, and it's very realistic in a sense, and you can definitely see that it's completely fleshed out. And I had the same feeling with this trilogy. And I feel like that's like something that I just enjoy in general. Maybe that's why these two are some of my favorites.
Okay, well, thank
What
you.
was it
Another
again?
book on the TBR.
Yeah, no, I'm about to write it down. I didn't catch what you said the title was.
It's the Chronicle of the Unhewn Throne trilogy, and first book is the Emperor's Blades, I think.
Oh yeah, we have those. We're gonna read that. Aren't we?
Oh, I
Yeah.
have that book. somewhere.
Yeah.
He-
I think I have
I
read
don't know
that.
what it's about. I buy stuff, I see people review, and I don't even know what they're about.
Yeah. Yolene recommended it, so I bought it. So.
and he bought me
Probably
one.
last
I bought
Safe
it.
choice.
It's like, what is this? But now I'm excited.
Buddy read.
So I'm gonna let poor Yolene go and eat her pizza.
I need my pizza.
Yeah. Thanks very much
Thanks,
for hosting
guys.
this.
Yeah. Thanks for joining all. I had a great time. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.